no option but to make the kind of reaction they want to make. I know that there is a concern that for our land and for our continent, there are vast, should I call it, resources that are untapped. And therefore, there's what you call massive supply, should I call it, possibilities that we need to focus on. But no matter what dormant potentials are there, if people don't see predictability, people are going to be wary of making investment. So we may have huge land that we can put into greater cultivation that will bring the food supply up and reduce the price of food and so on. But for people to want to move into that, they need to have some amount of assurance that prices are stable, interest rates are stable, foreign currency is stable. Then they are much more encouraged to want to do so. And for me, the more important one, which is a sociological trouble, a sociological dilemma, is our pricing culture that we need to address. And I'm sure once it is that we can honestly confront some of these things, we would see a much more predictable system generally. And that predictability will bring about the necessary growth for private sector and of course bring about the employment and the higher income that we need. Thank you very much.
I think the case is made, and now we almost have a new theory of inflation in Ghana. The social, psychological, and cultural way of pricing. I just parked my car at the airport yesterday, and I was made to pay 20 Ghana cedis. Last year I did that, and I paid 5 Ghana cedis. So government was somehow not featured in the 4 factors. But we'll continue. Let Gyekye respond to some of the issues and give his own perspective.
So the jury is up, but it's almost home, yeah. Anyway, thanks a lot. I think that was very heartfelt and candid, and that in itself, I think, is to be welcome and is very refreshing. And I think that the way you pitched it, not at the psychological level at the end, but at the beginning, the philosophical level, at the level of the fact that stability is good. In a way, nobody would disagree with that, even though it depends on what we mean by stability, because we can also mean things can be so stable that they become stagnant, for example. That's one dimension. The second thing is that, and so I want to start perhaps on a note that might be a note of controversy. You're right. Stability is good at the level of prices and predictability and so on and so forth. But that same predictability also means that, so in the same way that you ought to try and contain inflation to ensure that there is not too much price rises, you also ought to be concerned that the values that people get also doesn't collapse too much. In other words, disinflation can be just as important as inflation. I'll give you an example. Take agriculture in Ghana. We know, for example, that there is a lot of situations where let's say today on the streets of Accra, right here down the TUC traffic light, you see all these yam sellers, and they've been there for weeks. Because clearly there is some bumper crop in yam for now. They are trying hard to sell as much as they want, they sell now. I'm sure the bottom has fallen out of the market, and there is massive disinflation in terms of their returns compared to what they must have invested in it. That's why it's all the way to here. They are suffering no stability in terms of the incomes that they earn from their farming. And before long, there'll be a shortage of farming, there'll be a shortage of yam, and there'll be a flip side in which consumers are now bearing the price of instability. In other words, there's a structural basis for the type of instabilities that we face. In our case, and I think that the minister, what do I call you, by the way?
Oh, it's cool. I mean, comrade.
Okay. Okay. Comrade is the making minister. My point is that, so I'm not too good with honorables and excellences and so on. So I think we're all excellent and honorable till proven otherwise. So yeah. so basically, because the fact does remain that the kinds of things that I think that the Fiifi was beginning to adduce as factors in the question of price instability in our country, beyond the pricing culture thing, which I'll come to in a minute, are important. Because some of the things that he was saying, in fact, in the beginning, he left it out altogether. He kind of said, basically, that you need predictability, prices go up, and so on and so forth. But in our experience, we know where the tendencies and those things come. And when he spoke about exchange rates, it begins to shed light on the condition that we're facing. If you take any given year, the key drivers of price changes in this country usually are petroleum products, food, utilities. Now, all of them happen to be precisely those things where you have a collapse, a structural imbalance in terms of, one, domestic production, and 2, in terms of the weight of foreign imports, in terms of the competitive edge that they have, and 3, and the way in which there's an interface with the exchange rate conditions here. If you have a situation of collapsing domestic agricultural production, where the productivity that Fiifi is correctly pointing out, we are not recognizing, is not there, then what do? You see, it's interesting that we should be having a discussion like this at this time. And especially when maybe, I don't know whether the topic is slightly unfair to the minister, when you say private sector and jobs, because you see, the one problem is that jobs and production need not always depend on the private sector. I'm saying this not for ideological purposes, but for us to be realistic about what we need to break the logjam that we're facing. The structural logjam that we're facing, which I think that the minister's comments began to address. Here you are in a situation, we are in a so-called global crisis. When a global crisis which is characterized by a number of things, one of which is increasing unemployment. Let's be clear, before we got to the stage of economic organization and social organization, where the most important means of production were privately owned, there is no such thing as unemployment. In other words, until the rise of the private sector, the world never heard of mass unemployment before. If my household was my economy, who is going to be unemployed? Nobody. But when it comes to the point where the land that you're talking about belongs to some people and others are excluded, the machinery that you talk about belongs to some people, others are excluded, the foreign exchange that you talk about, that banks and financial money traders can speculate on and others are excluded from, there's no access to credit, or there's a double tier credit system where the big corporates gain access to the cheapest credit, including the banks, just like you pointed out. But ordinary producers themselves have inflated credit, just like you pointed out, even though the corporate sector that will be able to borrow from banks on the basis of the fact that they're using the treasury bill rates and so on and so forth at their benchmark, at least they get some access. How about the people that we heard of earlier this morning? Those who borrow at the rate of 15% a month, if you compound it on an annualized basis, an incredible 180% a year. I mean, please. So, the question really then is, and when those same private sector and their failures on a global scale, and let's be clear that we have impacts on an external scale that have not been factored in when we talk about our inflation, the way we're talking about it. And when you have those impacts coming in as well, and you have a wide open economy where the portfolio people can come in and go out, when they're your main bidders when it comes to selling your government bonds, then even your debt management instruments are problematic. My point really is this, and I want to kind of make 3 points and then I'll close. My point really is this. Fiifi is absolutely right. Monetary policy stabilization, yes, we agree. But where is the source of the instability is the first thing. I'm suggesting it's 2 things. One, it is that it is structural, and that structure has a number of different elements. The first element is the dominance of the external over the domestic. The second element is the dominance of finance over the real productive sector itself. The third is the collapse of and the failure of inability to transform small-scale petty production on the one hand and the primary commodity export dependency that we have on the other hand. And let me start with the last point. If you are in a situation where farmers are, because of trade liberalization, for example, are facing every aspect of the circuit of their production, every aspect is becoming increasingly commoditized, increasingly commercialized, increasingly monetized. Okay? So whether it is their seeds, or the land, like you said, or the technology, or the seeds, or whatever it is, at every single stage, what they would have used as their production fund, which comes from their previous income, and the fact that there's no more stable agricultural incomes, all those things are sacrificed. You get to the point where, quite frankly, people are being priced out of it. In fact, that is the only reason why we have the informal sector that we are lamenting today. Because previously, when there was migration from town to country, it is on the basis of the fact that you have a genuine and realistic expectation that the formal sector allows you a graduation. If you think that your rural conditions are poor, the formal sector in the urban areas allows you a graduation from that to there. Clearly, the formal sector, the informal sector with its unpredictability is not necessarily a graduation, right? But it's an absolute necessity. It is a stopgap measure in the hope that one day, somehow, you will climb into the formal sector. That's number one. But the fact is that it speaks of a complete collapse at the level of the rural. Without that, nobody will make that gambit, that calculation, that you're coming to live in some godforsaken place with no title, no landlord who, you sleep on a pavement in Accra, they charge you advance rent. So forget about being in a house. Right? Absolutely, please, Mr. Mayor, tonight I can take you down the road. It's not, yeah. You will pay for it. Rain or shine, you pay. Even if you have to wake up from your pavement and stand in the doorway till the rain stop paying, you will still pay that night. And we all know what happens to other people who are a lot more vulnerable. So I'm simply pointing out to that the circuit of production has been broken. It has been broken not because of the innate inability or unwillingness of Ghanaian farmers, for example, to up their productivity. I am saying that the structural conditions and the systemic conditions in this case that should allow them to be able to upgrade to stabilize their incomes, to stabilize their production, to ensure that the yields that they used to be, ability of increasing has, is diminishing. Today we heard, for example, that it's just like the rest of the economy. We have such excess capacity, and I think, again, the minister referred to that. When you have agricultural producers who are producing maybe only 30 to 50% of the known potential yield, and factories are producing at 70%, 20%, I am saying that we have massive excess capacity, which actually calls into question the kind of way in which we are understanding inflation. Because if you are in a situation where government is borrowing money through the central bank, the public deficit is being monetized, and you are in a situation where you are under capacity, that excess money that is coming into the system, supposing it is coming into people's pockets, and at the same time production is being undertaken, then where is the problem? Production is being financed, the extra output of goods and services that are being generated, the extra money is in people's pockets, you buy it. In which case, all you have is one cancelling each other out. Just like the advanced countries which Fiifi described in terms of the fact that if you are banked or not banked. Well, really, the structural underpinning of the banked or not banked is that there is a situation where the formal wage sector, the rules and regulations that apply in terms of your wages, in terms of salaries, and so on and so forth, when there's a feed-through effect because of the monetization in the economy, one thing balances the other out. In our case, it's not like that. There's too many leakages on the external front, and so on and so forth. The second thing about the thing is, as I pointed out, is the relationship between finance and the real economy. Where you have a situation, and again, I'm sorry, that's why when we talk about a pricing culture, that's how I immediately understand it. First and foremost, if we are an aberrant extremist when it comes to our wild private culture, pricing culture in this country, compared to the rest of Africa, then there's one reason and one reason alone. We are the people who have liberalized the longest and the most in this country. We are the ones who were the pioneers in structural adjustment and economic recovery program. We had the biggest single state sector, second only to Egypt in Africa. So the scale of collapse of production capacity is unparalleled. And at the same time, the scale of private gain by all those, the bailouts to the public sector, even the financial sector. I remember when they were cleaning up the first structural adjustment, which nobody talks about, was actually strictly for the financial sector. Okay, face up and so on and so forth. Okay, all those people who had borrowed money, didn't pay back, those generals, those corporate people and so on and so, they went away with it scot-free. The rest of us, we subsidized it, we nationalized the debt, we paid for it, and they made their money and they went away. And you get to the point where it is the grab of everybody because the heart of the productive act of the economy is in a complete mess. And the speculative impulse is the most powerful one. And you have one in which that the chief speculators are the ones who are lauded the most, they are the most successful, they are the ones who are the benchmarks of what the rest of us ought to do. And I think from that point of view, it's unfair, really, to be talking about workers. Because we know that from the end of 1970s until now, Ghanaian workers also took the hardest cut in wage anywhere in Africa. We know that. They took it year after year after year, more than a decade and a half. It got to a stage so much so that when they began to rise, then HIPIC policy too came in. So they had to take another hit. In fact, sometimes the game is given away, unwittingly. I was at a funeral for Smart Chigabatia, former head of Civil Servants Association. And former President Kufuor came there in all his glory to give a tribute to Smart Chigabatia. He said, Smart Chigabatia is a great workers' leader. Because when we wanted to go HIPIC, and the IMF and the World Bank told us that we must cut back our public expenditure, even though the workers were due a salary increase. When we spoke to Smart, he went back and convinced his workers to sacrifice. And that's how we went. Now, I am not too sure what kind of good trade union leader that is. May his soul rest in peace, of course. But, his soul may be fine, but his record as a workers' leader is poor, if that's what we have to remember him by. The fact is that because those are ingredients that count. You see, in our economy, that is a doubly charged issue. Because you have an economy where the formal sector is so small, the predictability of incomes is so low. The same security that we're talking about, when it comes to the construction and sustainability of domestic demand, the predictability of incomes of households is so poor and so low that actually, even if workers constitute, formal sector workers constitute only 11 or 10 or 12% of the formal wage sector, the fact does remain that they finance together the rest of us. In every sense of the word. And I mean, you can look at even some of the government's own figures in that respect, to look at that. So when you have this falling agricultural incomes on the one hand, you have this massive, desperate informal sector in the middle, and then you have this squeeze, 25-year-long squeeze on workers, from which they're only suddenly beginning to recover. And all of a sudden, that makes them devils with horns, and they should all join Smart wherever it's gone. I don't think so. I think, on the contrary, that if you have a different policy which says that part of the thing that we ought to tackle when we deal with the inflation is the supply side constraint. The supply side constraint in the sense that if you are in a condition of over liberalization such as we are, if you're in a condition of over speculation on land such as we are, so for example, real estate people who use land, there are areas where there's agricultural land being priced at the same price as real estate because the real estate people can get land that amount of money. So that means if I'm going to grow my cassava or tomato, I should, clearly that makes no sense. Only government regulation and a government macroeconomic strategy that is predicated on privileging production-based growth so that productivity becomes part of it. It is the only way to address questions like this. Otherwise, otherwise most of your inflation, as I said, is import based anyway. When oil prices go up, everything goes up, right? Sorry. When oil prices go up, everything goes up, including food prices. When global food prices go up, it also goes up. When the rain falls, it also it also goes up. Utility prices, so on and so forth. The same thing. How many minutes do I have? 50. Oh, thank you.
1.5.
So basically, you have a situation.
It's inflating the time for you.
at no cost.
Because of unpredictability.
So you have a situation where if you have and then on top of that, we have to understand that public policy has been shaped by the goal, not simply of deflation and inflation control, because actually in official terms, our real inflation targeting policy started in 2002 as part of the HIPC. Then it became formalized in 2006. Okay, so really, strictly speaking, and even between 2002 and 2006, you had a coexistence with that, with some attempt to manage exchange rates quite a bit, which was abandoned after the full final, what do you call it, decision point onwards. But my point really here is that you have a situation where the goal of public macroeconomic management has been, since the 1980s, to ensure that as much of public funds as possible goes to paying off debt. That was the legacy of the debt crisis. And that hasn't changed, fundamentally. So, for example, Fiifi talks about stabilization and so on and so on, but the Bank of Ghana says that its chief goal in terms of, it's a macroeconomic policy things is, yes, domestic price inflation, addressing that, external price inflation, addressing that, addressing output, addressing employment. It has no target but one. Despite these 4 macroeconomic goals, it has no targets but one. It has only an inflation target. As I said, it does not have a disinflation target. It does not have a bottom about how far prices should not drop so that, let's say, farmers and so on and so on. It doesn't have that. It only has inflation. That's it. Now, but you have multiple goals. How do you use one policy instrument to address multiple goals which may conflict with each other? You even have no room for maneuver because you cannot use an inflation target policy, which in this case actually falls back to one policy, interest rates. To use that same policy to stimulate growth-inducing domestic investors to produce, you can't. That same one policy does not allow you to do that. You will do one at the expense of the other. And that's why we get to a situation where we have 4 choices. Either workers have a decent living wage or the whole economy goes to the dogs. I'm sorry, that choice is not always a correct one. We have other choices. And those are the things that I think I want to spend the last few minutes to kind of explore.